Imagine for a second that a rumor about you goes completely viral.
Oh, that's a nightmare scenario.
Right, like it is completely false. But suddenly your career is ruined, your family is being harassed, and, everyone you thought you knew is passing this piece of gossip along.
Because they think it's just a joke or, it's just harmless workplace chatter.
Exactly. But how do you stop the mob? Like, once a lie is out there in the world, how do you actually protect a person's dignity?
It's one of the hardest questions we face today.
It really is. And today we are looking at a text from the 7th century desert that built this shockingly modern, almost impenetrable defense system against what we would now call cancel culture and fake news.
It really is brilliant when you dig into it.
Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
So glad to be jumping into this.
Today, we are taking texts that were born in this crucible of severe persecution and societal upheaval. And we're extracting the DNA of what makes a person truly resilient and, what makes a society genuinely just.
Yeah, we're covering a lot of ground.
We really are. We are moving from the battlefield to the deep internal architecture of your character and finally, right into your own living room.
Literally into your living room.
Literally. For this deep dive, we are focusing our attention on 3 really profound sections of the Qur'an. That's chapters 22, 23, and 24, also known as the pilgrimage, the believers, and the light.
And, to really grasp the gravity of what is happening in these texts, we can't just dive straight into the verses.
Right, we need context.
Exactly. We have to set the stage because the historical and, the human context shifts dramatically between these chapters. I mean, earth-shatteringly so.
How so? Like, what's the shift?
So we are looking at a massive transition in the life of the early Muslim community. Chapters 22 and 23 largely represent the Meccan period, with a few later additions. And this was a time when the community was just incredibly vulnerable.
And when you say vulnerable, I think we need to be clear about what that actually looked like on the ground, because we aren't just talking about people being mocked or, feeling socially alienated at dinner parties.
No, not at all. We are talking about an existential threat. 7th century Mecca was a deeply tribal society.
Meaning there's no overarching government?
Right. There was no central police force, no centralized state government, no human rights tribunal you could appeal to. Your physical safety depended entirely on your tribal affiliation.
Wow. So if your tribe kicks you out...
If your tribe casts you out, your blood was essentially legal to spill.
That is terrifying.
It is. And when these early believers started declaring our Lord is Allah, they were fundamentally rejecting the polytheistic structure that underpinned the entire Meccan economy.
Because Mecca was like a tourist hub for idols, right?
Exactly. It relied heavily on pilgrimage to idol shrines. So when this new monotheistic message threatened that, the ruling elite cracked down brutally. Believers were starved, they were tortured in the desert sun, and they were systematically expelled from their homes.
I read that some of them were so desperate they had to flee across the Red Sea, right, to Abyssinia.
Yeah, exactly. And that detail is actually crucial. The Prophet advised a group of these really vulnerable early Muslims to seek asylum in Abyssinia, which is modern-day Ethiopia and Eritrea.
And why there, specifically?
Because it was ruled by a Christian king who was known for his justice, and he gave them sanctuary.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's an incredible early example of interfaith solidarity in the face of persecution. But, for the rest of the community, they eventually had to make a mass migration, the Hijra, to a city called Medina.
Okay, let's unpack this transition, because going from Mecca to Medina is kind of everything in this story. In Medina, they aren't running anymore.
That is the pivotal shift. Chapter 24, the light, is a Medinan revelation. In Mecca, you are fighting for your very survival. Your priorities are incredibly narrow.
Right. Stay alive.
Right. Stay alive, protect your family, hold on to your core beliefs under immense physical and psychological pressure. But when you finally achieve safety, when you arrive in a place like Medina and you actually have power, when you have to govern yourselves, the real work of maintaining a moral society begins.
It's a completely different skill set.
Completely different. Survival requires endurance and fortitude. Society building requires boundaries, justice, legislation, and managing interpersonal conflict.
So it's like a modern startup.
Right. And that's an interesting way to look at it.
I mean, think of a small tech company operating out of a garage, and they're being aggressively sued by this massive, ruthless, trillion-dollar monopoly.
Right, they're under siege.
Exactly. In phase 1, like the Meccan phase, You just need to survive.
Right.
You aren't thinking about 401ks or vacation time. You are sleeping under your desk, you're eating ramen, and you're just trying to keep the servers from crashing.
Just keeping the lights on.
Right. But in phase 2, the Medinan phase, if you actually survive that initial monopoly and you become a real company with hundreds of employees, suddenly you have to figure out your HR policies.
Yes.
You have to figure out your corporate culture and how people are treating each other in the break room. Because if the culture rots from the inside out, surviving that initial monopoly didn't even matter.
That is a brilliant analogy, honestly, because what's fascinating here is how universal that human experience really is. The text addresses both phases of the human condition perfectly.
How so?
Well, in the Meccan phase, the threat is entirely external. It's the oppressor outside the door. But in the Medinan phase, the threat is internal. The threat is hypocrisy. It is gossip. It is the breakdown of social trust. It raises this really profound question about human nature. Often, the very people who can survive a physical siege struggle to survive the psychological complexities of peacetime.
Which brings this right to you, the listener. Think about where you are in your life right now. Are you in, Meccan survival mode?
Yeah, that's a great question to ask yourself.
Maybe you're just trying to keep your head above water financially, or you're dealing with a sudden, terrifying health crisis, and it's all about just making it to tomorrow. Or are you in Medinan mode?
Where the immediate crisis has passed.
Exactly. The challenge isn't surviving anymore. It's the harder, quieter work of building good habits, establishing healthy boundaries, and dealing with the internal rot of your own bad tendencies.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the text provides a roadmap for navigating both of those states.
Okay, let's look at that roadmap.
So let's look at how the transition is managed. How do you take a traumatized group of people who have just been violently oppressed, give them agency, and stop them from becoming the very monsters they just escaped?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right. And chapter 22, The Pilgrimage, acts as a bridge here. This chapter contains some of the very first permissions given to this community to physically defend themselves.
Okay, I have to stop you here because I want to push it back a bit.
Sure, go ahead.
This is exactly where a lot of modern readers, definitely including myself, hit a massive obstacle to growth. When we encounter ancient texts that mention, permission to fight, we immediately flinch.
Oh, absolutely.
Our modern brains assume this equates to unbridled fanaticism or holy war in the absolute worst sense of the term. We think of forced conversions and violence. How do we not just write this off as archaic tribal warfare?
It is a very understandable modern reaction, but this is exactly where we need wisdom with discernment. We have to look at the mechanism of what the text is actually doing here.
Okay, explain the mechanism.
So in 7th century Arabia, the standard mechanism for conflict was the blood feud.
Right. An eye for an eye, but worse.
Much worse. If someone wronged your tribe, you didn't just fight the perpetrator. You wiped out their family, their allies, you took their property. It was unrestrained tribal vengeance.
So no proportional response at all?
None. Now let's look at the primary text. Verse 39 says, "Permission is given to fight to those upon whom war is made because they are oppressed and have been expelled from their homes."
So it's strictly conditional on self-defense?
That's directly. But the real revolution is in verse 40.
Right. Verse 40 makes this incredibly profound statement. It says that if God did not repel some people by others, then cloisters and churches and synagogues and mosques, and with Allah's name as much remembered, would have been pulled down.
Yes.
Wait, so the very first time this text allows physical fighting, the explicit goal isn't just to protect Muslims, it specifically mandates the protection of Christian churches and Jewish synagogues.
It is breathtaking when you place it in its historical context.
It really is.
Remember the blood feud we just talked about? The natural human inclination of this traumatized, newly empowered community would be pure tribal exclusivity. But the text immediately circumscribes their permission to fight with the foundational principle of universal religious freedom.
Which feels completely countercultural even today, let alone 1,300 years ago.
Precisely. The historical commentary in our sources notes that this principle of tolerance in Arabia was entirely revolutionary. The directive isn't just to tolerate other faiths.
Just put up with them.
Right, it's not passive. It is a mandate to actively defend their right to worship. Notice the order of the places of worship listed in the verse.
Cloisters, churches, synagogues, and then mosques.
Yes, the mosques are listed last. The Muslims are being told that their willingness to sacrifice their own safety is intrinsically tied to protecting the vulnerable, regardless of their specific theology. It breaks the tribal blood feud system entirely and replaces it with the defense of pluralism.
So the mechanism here is using defense not for conquest, but to ensure diversity can exist. So what does this all mean for us today? Because most of us aren't literally taking up arms, but we all have our tribes, right?
Oh, heavily so.
We have our political parties, our social circles, our ideological allies. This text challenges our modern tribalism head on.
It really does.
The practical application here is a hard question you have to ask yourself. Who outside of your immediate circle are you willing to stand up for? Like, if you only fight for the rights of people who look, vote, and think exactly like you, are you really fighting for justice? Or are you just protecting your own interests?
That is the exact internal pivot the text demands. It shifts the focus from outward tribal identity to inward integrity. And, it makes a similar radical pivot regarding the concept of sacrifice.
Okay, let's talk about that.
Chapter come to is called a pilgrimage because it extensively discusses the rituals established originally by Abraham, specifically animal sacrifice.
Another thing modern listeners might seriously flinch at. Animal sacrifice feels very ancient, very brutal, and completely disconnected from a 21st century mindset.
It does. But again, look at why the text mentions it and how it redefines the mechanism of sacrifice. In the ancient world, animal sacrifice was highly transactional.
Like buying a favor from the gods.
Exactly. You killed an animal to appease an angry god, or to magically wipe away your own sins through the literal shedding of blood. It was a physical transaction meant to manipulate the divine.
Right.
But chapter 22, verse 37, strips all of that magical thinking away entirely. It says, of the sacrificed animals, there does not reach Allah their flesh nor their blood, but to him is acceptable the guarding against evil on your part.
The guarding against evil on your part. Some translations call it mindfulness or piety or God consciousness, right? It's entirely internal.
Right. Our sources point out that the outward act of sacrifice in this text is completely emptied of the old superstitious meanings. It becomes a purely symbolic expression of an inward reality.
So the meat is just wheat.
The meat is just meat. In fact, the text explicitly says to feed the poor and the beggar with it. It functions as an ancient social welfare system. The real sacrifice isn't the animal.
What is it then?
The real sacrifice is your own ego, your own selfish desires, and your readiness to lay down your own interests in the cause of truth.
Okay, that translates perfectly into the modern world because we all still make sacrifices, right?
All the time.
We sacrifice our time for our jobs, participating in hustle culture. We make sacrifices for our partners or our kids. We go through these intense outward motions of giving up our energy.
Right, the modern version of the flesh and blood.
Exactly. But the practical reflection here is evaluate your own sacrifices. Are you just going through the outward motions, giving the meat and blood of your time and energy so that people will applaud you? Like, are you working 80 hours a week just so people think you're important?
Wow. Yeah, that's a tough mirror to look into.
Or do you actually have that internal mindfulness? Are you making sacrifices with a pure intention to genuinely help others? Or are you just performing a modern ritual of productivity or martyrdom?
That internal architecture, moving from outward performance to inward reality, is the perfect segue into chapter 23, which is titled The Believers, because this chapter opens by completely redefining what it means to be successful.
And it wastes no time. Verse 1 says, "Successful indeed are the believers." But then it lists the criteria for success over the next 10 verses, and it has absolutely nothing to do with what society usually measures.
Right. No mention of bank accounts.
None. There's no mention of how much wealth you've accumulated, what your title is, or how many followers you have.
The metrics of success here are entirely character-driven and community-focused. Who are this successful? The text says they are humble in their prayers. They keep aloof from what is vain. They act aiming at purification, which in this context refers specifically to zakat.
Let's define zakat for the listener, because it's not just tossing a few coins into a donation bin.
No, zakat is a foundational mechanism in this society. It literally translates to purification. It is an obligatory, calculated social tax on accumulated wealth.
So it's systemic.
Highly systemic. The philosophy is that your wealth is not entirely your own. A portion of it rightfully belongs to the poor and marginalized. By giving it away, you are actively purifying the rest of your wealth from greed and hoarding.
So true success involves systematically decoupling yourself from greed.
Exactly. Furthermore, the successful game are those who guard their chastity. And crucially, they are keepers of their trusts and their covenants.
I love that phrase, keepers of their trusts and covenants. It's a blueprint for quiet integrity.
How so?
It means if you say you're going to do something, you do it. If a coworker confides in you, you hold that trust. You are a vault. You don't leverage other people's vulnerability for your own social capital.
I completely agree. But what's fascinating here is how the chapter immediately transitions from this list of high moral characteristics into a detailed biological description of human creation.
Oh, this part is wild.
It is. In verses 12 through 14, the text traces human embryonic development. It says humanity is created from an extract of clay or dust, which becomes a life germ, then a clot, then a lump of flesh, then bones, and finally those bones are clothed with flesh.
Why the sudden shift to embryonic biology? It feels totally jarring. It's like dropping a medical textbook right into the middle of a moral philosophy text. What is the mechanism here?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is a profound metaphor for evolution. The text is demanding a spiritual evolution that directly parallels our physical evolution.
Oh, I see.
Think about it. Physically, you start as something incredibly base and humble dust, a microscopic life germ. But through a structured developmental process, you grow into a highly complex, capable, fully formed human being.
Oh, wow. So just as you wouldn't expect a human body to stay in the embryonic stage, you shouldn't expect your soul to stay in its base default state.
Precisely. The physical growth from dust to flesh is largely automatic. But the spiritual growth from a state of raw, unrefined impulses to a state of high moral integrity, humility, consistent charity, keeping promises, that requires immense intentional effort.
You don't just drift into being a good person.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The physical evolution is a sign pointing toward the necessary spiritual evolution. You are meant to grow out of your selfishness, just as you grew out of being a lump of flesh.
And one of the biggest hurdles in that spiritual evolution, according to verse 3, is that the successful ones keep aloof from what is vain.
Yes, that is a huge one.
The source texts clarify this means frivolous, useless, or toxic talk. Let's translate this into today's reality, because if there was ever an era in human history defined by vain talk, it is the digital age.
Without question. The 7th century concept of vain talk scales perfectly to the 21st century attention economy.
Today, vain talk is doom scrolling for 2 hours before bed, looking at arguments between strangers.
Oh, absolutely.
It's participating in the daily outrage cycle on social media, where everyone is screaming at each other over a sensationalized headline that nobody actually read.
Right, the clickbait culture.
It's consuming endless, empty content that leaves you feeling anxious, drained, and completely disconnected from your actual physical life. It is the junk food of the soul.
And notice the specific verb used in the text. They keep aloof from it.
Yeah.
They don't just occasionally avoid it. They actively distance themselves from it. They recognize that engaging in frivolous, toxic discourse degrades their spiritual architecture.
That's a great way to phrase it.
And this echoes beautifully across other wisdom traditions as well. If you look at Stoic philosophy, Marcus Aurelius writes extensively about not letting the toxic, useless behaviors of others dictate your internal state. You see it later in chapter 23, verse 96, where the text instructs, repel evil by what is best.
Which is very similar to the Christian teaching of turning the other cheek, right?
Yes, but the commentary in our sources makes an interesting distinction about the mechanics of this verse. It suggests that repelling evil by what is best isn't just passive endurance.
So it's not just being a doormat.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It isn't just letting someone walk all over you. It is a highly practical, active instruction. It means neutralizing the toxicity of the world by injecting goodness back into it.
Wow.
If someone comes at you with vain, angry talk, you don't match their energy. You don't let their chaos dictate your response. You repel it with dignity.
That is incredibly difficult to do, which leads to a very practical how-to for you, the listener. Let's call it the vain talk audit.
I like that.
For the next 48 hours, I challenge you to strictly monitor your conversational and digital diet. Just pay attention. How much of your time is spent engaging in vain things, gossip, outrage, empty debates, or watching people tear each other down online that do not build you up and do not help anyone else?
That's a great exercise.
If your spiritual evolution is supposed to mirror your physical evolution, are you stunting your own growth by feeding your mind nothing but junk?
And that reflection brings us to one of the most intense, gripping, and frankly, shocking parts of our entire deep dive today. Chapter 24, The Light. Because if chapter 23 warns against vain talk, chapter 24 shows us the absolute devastation that vain talk can cause when it metastasizes into slander and systemic gossip.
This chapter is incredibly intense. And to really feel its impact, we have to lean heavily on that historical context we talked about at the very beginning.
Right. We are back in Medina now.
Medina. The community is somewhat established. They aren't being hunted in the desert anymore, but they are dealing with massive internal social rot.
Yes. And the specific context for a large portion of this chapter revolves around a very real, very painful historical event involving Isha, the wife of the prophet.
Set the scene for us. Tell the story because it's so dramatic.
It really is. During a desert expedition, the caravan had stopped to rest. Aisha realized she had dropped her necklace, so she went out into the desert to look for it. While she was gone, the caravan departed.
Wait, they just left her?
Well, they assumed she was in her howdah, the enclosed pavilion on a camel, and they left without her. She was stranded alone in the desert. Eventually, she was found by another member of the expedition who had fallen behind, a man who gave her his camel and walked her back to the camp.
So an honest mistake and a rescue.
Exactly. Just a very stressful but innocent situation. But in her absence, political opportunists saw a chance to strike. Specifically, a man named Abdullah bin Nubay.
Who was he?
Our sources identify him as a leading hypocrite in Medina, someone who outwardly claimed to be part of the community but secretly wanted to undermine the leadership. He saw Aisha returning with this man, and he manufactured a vicious, baseless rumor accusing her of adultery.
And the rumor spread.
It spread like wildfire. And the tragedy wasn't just that the hypocrites were spreading it. It was that otherwise good, normal members of the community started passing this gossip along.
Because it was juicy.
Right. They heard it, they repeated it at the market, they whispered about it in their homes. It caused immense trauma for Aisha, who fell ill from the stress. It nearly tore the community apart. And the revelation of chapter 24 came down as a direct, severe, society-altering response to this specific event.
And this is where I need to stop you, because this is where we had a massive, seemingly insurmountable obstacle for the modern reader.
Let's hear it.
Chapter 24 opens by prescribing a severe physical punishment for adultery. 100 stripes or lashes. I have to push back here.
Right ahead.
You're asking a modern listener to find enduring wisdom in a text that advocates physical flogging. I'm having a really hard time getting past that. Our brains immediately shut down. It feels harsh, archaic, and completely unrelatable. How do we extract anything useful from a 7th century penal code?
It is a vital pushback. And you are right. If you stop reading at the punishment for adultery, you miss the actual mechanics of the law.
What do you mean?
You have to separate the penal code of a specific 7th century legal context from the enduring moral architecture of the text. The text does not stop at the punishment. It immediately builds a massive, almost impenetrable legal fortress around people's reputations.
Okay.
Let's look at the very next verse, verse 4. It drops a legal bombshell on the community, it says. And those who accuse free women, then do not bring 4 witnesses, flog them, giving 80 stripes, and do not admit any evidence from them ever. And these it is that are the transgressors.
Wait, let me make sure I understand the mechanics of this. If I accuse someone of adultery, I have to produce 4 literal eyewitnesses to the act itself.
Yes, 4 direct corroborating eyewitnesses to the physical act of intimacy.
What? Not just circumstantial evidence.
Not circumstantial evidence, not hearsay, not I saw them walking together. 4 witnesses.
But that is practically impossible.
Exactly. That is the genius of the mechanism. The text is setting the burden of proof so impossibly high that it becomes practically impossible to legally convict someone based on rumors. It wasn't designed to make punishment easy. It was designed to make punishment incredibly rare while simultaneously protecting privacy.
Oh, I see. And the flip side is terrifying for the accuser.
Absolutely terrifying.
If I make the accusation and I can't produce those 4 witnesses, I am the one who gets punished. I get 80 stripes, and my testimony in any legal matter for the rest of my life is permanently rejected. I am labeled a liar in the eyes of the law forever.
Precisely. Do you see the enduring wisdom now? The profound lesson here isn't about the mechanics of 7th century corporal punishment. The profound lesson is the incredible gravity of destroying someone's reputation.
It's treating gossip like a major crime.
Yes. In the eyes of this text, stealing someone's dignity, honor, and social standing through slander is a crime almost equal to the physical act of adultery itself. By requiring this impossible burden of proof, the text effectively outlawed gossip. It created a legally protected zone of privacy and honor, particularly for women, against casual slander.
This is a 7th century answer to modern cancel culture.
It really is.
Think about how this mechanism applies to modern tech. Social media platforms today try to stop fake news by adding what they call friction.
Right, trying to slow the spread.
They try to slow you down. They might prompt you with a message asking, do you want to read this article before you retweet it? The four-witness rule was the ultimate 7th century friction.
That's a great analogy.
By threatening the accuser with severe punishment and lifelong social ruin if they didn't have absolute, undeniable proof, it made the cost of retweeting gossip terrifyingly high. It forced people to keep their mouths shut unless they were absolutely certain.
And look at how the text directly addresses the psychology of the mob in verse 15, rebuking the community for what they did to Aisha. It says, when you received it with your tongues and spoke with your mouths what you had no knowledge of, and you deemed it an easy matter, while with Allah it was grievous.
You received it with your tongues. That is such a striking psychological insight.
Isn't it?
It means you didn't even process the rumor with your brain. You didn't pause to use your critical thinking. You didn't ask, is this true? Do I have proof? What is the source? The gossip bypassed your intellect entirely. It went straight from someone else's mouth to your tongue, and you mindlessly passed it on.
And you deemed it an easy matter. People passing gossip always think it's harmless. It's just a joke. It's just a rumor. It's just something you heard at the water cooler.
Just workplace chatter.
Right. But the text asserts that the destruction of a human being's character is cosmically grievous. It shakes the very foundation of social trust. A society that casually accepts slander, that cancels people based on hearsay, cannot hold together. It will eat itself alive.
So the practical how-to for you, the listener, is what we'll call the four-witness rule. The next time you are tempted to retweet a viral accusation against someone, or you are sitting in the break room and someone starts sharing a juicy piece of unverified gossip about a coworker, stop.
Yes, just stop.
Ask yourself, do I have absolute, undeniable proof that this is true? Am I a direct witness? If not, what kind of damage am I participating in? By passing this on, am I becoming the very toxicity I claim to hate? Do not receive information only with your tongue.
It forces a radical, uncomfortable accountability on our speech. And, what is truly brilliant about chapter 24 is how it weaves these incredibly grounded, mundane, legalistic social rules with some of the most soaring, mystical poetry in the entire Qur'an.
Oh, yes.
Because right in the middle of these intense laws about slander, burdens of proof, and social friction, we get verse 35, the famous parable of the light.
It is arguably one of the most beautiful passages in world religious literature. The imagery is stunning. It says, Allah is the light of the heavens and the earth. A likeness of his light is as a niche in which is a lamp. The lamp is in a glass, and the glass is, as it were, a brightly shining star, lit from a blessed olive tree, neither eastern nor western, the oil whereof almost gives light, though fire touch it not. It just takes your breath away.
It is purely cosmic. The depth of the imagery is profound. The sources tell us that the blessed olive tree, neither eastern nor western, represents a truth that transcends geographical, tribal, and cultural boundaries.
It belongs to everyone.
Exactly. It isn't owned by the East or the West. It is universal. An olive tree in the desert was a symbol of sustenance, endurance, and life. The light here represents divine truth, clarity, and spiritual awakening. It is a profound meditation on enlightenment.
But here is the jarring juxtaposition. We just read this stunning mystical poetry about cosmic light, a light that illuminates the heavens and the earth. We are soaring in the philosophical clouds. And then surrounding this poetry in the very same chapter, the text immediately drops back down to earth and is essentially saying, hey, don't barge into your neighbor's house unannounced.
It is a phenomenal contrast, isn't it? We go from the light of the heavens straight into verse 27. O you who believe, do not enter houses other than your own houses until you have asked permission and saluted their inmates.
Right.
And then verses 30 and 31, commanding both men and women to lower their gaze and guard their modesty. And verse 58, which literally lays out the specific times of day before morning prayer, at noon when you take off your clothes for the heat, and after the night prayer, the children and servants need to knock and ask permission before entering their parents' bedroom.
It's so hyper-practical. I have to admit, when I first read it, it felt like a collision of two completely different books. Like, why wrap this profound, transcendent, mystical insight inside a manual on domestic privacy?
Because that collision is the point. This is perhaps the ultimate synthesis of our entire deep dive today. True enlightenment. The light isn't found just by meditating on a mountaintop, isolating yourself, or reciting beautiful poetry.
Where is it found then?
It is manifested in the dirt and grit of everyday life. It is manifested in how deeply you respect the dignity, the reputation, and the physical boundaries of the people around you.
So you cannot claim to hold the divine light if you lack basic respect for human privacy.
Exactly. Our sources point out that the mechanics of 7th century Arab society lacked almost any concept of domestic privacy. People lived in close quarters, in tents or simple houses, and the custom was just to walk into each other's homes unannounced.
Oh, wow.
By instituting these rules, asking permission, lowering the gaze, teaching children to knock on bedroom doors, the text was abolishing a careless custom. It was creating the security and privacy needed for an advanced, civilized society. The light of truth isn't just an abstract concept. It is the tangible respect that allows human beings to live together in peace without tearing each other apart.
That reframes everything about what it means to be spiritual. Enlightenment is boundaries. Enlightenment is knocking on a door. Enlightenment is not staring at things that aren't yours to see.
It's highly practical.
That brings us to a really vital reflection for all of us. Take a hard look at the boundaries in your own life. Are you respecting the emotional and physical houses of those around you?
Good question.
Do you knock before dumping your problems on a friend, asking if they actually have the emotional bandwidth to hear it today? Are you lowering your gaze? Meaning, are you refusing to pry into the private lives, the mistakes, and the social media histories of others?
It's the realization that profound spiritual truths are lived out in the most ordinary, mundane moments. How you treat your neighbor, how you speak about a coworker who isn't in the room, how you handle a piece of unverified information on your phone. That is the actual tangible measure of your proximity to the like.
It all comes back to that internal scale. The inward reality versus the outward performance, which is exactly where we are going to end today. Because as we wrap up this deep dive into these 3 incredible chapters, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over, drawing back to chapter 23, verses 102 and 103.
The weighing of the soul.
Yes. The text presents an image of the final day of reckoning, a moment of ultimate truth, and it says a scale will be used to weigh a human life. It says, then as for him whose good deeds are preponderant, these are the successful. And as for him whose good deeds are light, these are they who shall have lost their souls.
Preponderant, meaning heavy.
Yeah.
Having real weight, density, and substance.
Yes. Heavy. In a modern world that constantly weighs you by entirely different superficial metrics, by your bank account, your follower count, your job title, or your daily hustle and productivity, what does the scale of your actual quiet character look like when absolutely nobody is watching?
When it's just you and the truth.
Right. If your inner intentions, your restraint from gossip, your respect for other people's boundaries, your willingness to stand up for people outside your tribe, if all of that were placed on a scale today, would your character be heavy with substance? Or would it be light, filled with nothing but the empty air of vain talk?
That is the question we all have to answer.
That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.